I think what I can do a few housekeeping matters whilst we're still waiting for people to join. Perhaps the first thing I should say is that we are recording this event, so it will be available on our website in due course. So you, people who have not been able to catch all of it will be able to catch it in due course. And because we're recording it, obviously that means that you might need to think carefully about any personal information you provide if you participate in the interactive elements, including if you use the Q&A function. So just be sort of conscious of that in terms of any information that you choose to share. So that's, in a sense, a fairly basic piece of housekeeping. The other housekeeping matter is we do very much encourage and would like you to participate in the event actively as opposed to purely passively, and to that end we have got time set down towards the end of the session for questions and answers. And the way that we're going to try to work that is if people want to use the Q&A function, which I'm sure you're all familiar with at the foot of your screens, to type in a question. If you do that, that gives us at least some material that we can review. And then depending on how much time we've got and whether there's time for further exchanges, we will see as we get towards the end. So we would encourage you to do that if there are questions that you want to pose. So I think we will now make a start, and perhaps I should start with the introductions. I'm Michael Bedford, Queen's Counsel, one of the planning team at Cornerstone Barristers, and I'm very pleased to be joined by Estelle Dehon, who is not only another key member of the planning team at Cornerstone Barristers. Many of you will know she is one of the planners, Women of Influence 2020, as she was in 2019 and 2018. She's a trustee and council member of UKLA, and she's a trustee of the Women's Environmental Network. So I'm very pleased to be joined by Estelle in sharing this presentation.
Thanks, Michael.
So what are we talking about this afternoon? Well, this is another webinar forming part of our Cornerstone Barristers Planning Week. We're on day 2, and as you can see, we're on the afternoon topic, is net zero still cool? And so that's the issue that we're going to address, and you can see very quickly from that screen what also is coming up later on in the week. So if you haven't already signed up to those later sessions, I think it's still perfectly possible for you to do so, so please do so if they attract your interest. So if we then move specifically to this afternoon, and perhaps I should say that some of this material I'm responsible for the black and white bits, and Estelle's responsible for the imagery, and you might see that there's a bit of a difference between Estelle and me, and that one of us takes a Tigger-like role and one of us takes a more Eeyore-like role, and it wouldn't take too many surprises to work out which of us is which. Now, we've split the presentation into 2, following some introductory remarks from me just about what net zero is. I'm going to look at the issue of whether it is a break or a hurdle or an obstacle to development. And Estelle is going to look at the more positive sides of things, which is what development opportunities does net zero give rise to. Those of you who might have already looked at your paper, which we've, I think, provided online with the link with the joining instructions, will have noted that if you've looked through that paper, it really only deals with my part of the presentation. And the simple reason for that is because I'm the author of that paper, and Estelle is intending to provide a written summary of her contribution. It's covered in the slides, but she's intended to provide a written summary of her contribution after the event, and we'll post that on the website. So when I say when you've looked through my paper, which is a little bit dry and dull, I have to say, don't be surprised that there is none of the enthusiasm from Estelle embedded in that paper. So let's then deal with the nuts and bolts. What is net zero? And we've got a statutory framework. I've just given you the references. I haven't set out what the Act has to say. You'll be all aware of the 2019 order, which makes the amendment and introduces the net zero target itself. But the BEIS, the Department Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, has set out its take on really what net zero means, and it's actually quite a handy definition. This was in a press release they issued back in June 2019. Any emissions that would be balanced by schemes to offset an equivalent amount. And then they said, such as planting trees or using technology like carbon capture and storage. So that's what it is. There's a regime in the Act for targets and for measuring. And in terms of the figures, the headlines are that the 1990 baseline, which is what effectively matters are measured from, the UK produced some 794 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent. The paper sets out what that means. In a sense, it's not just carbon, there are other gases that go into it. It's equivalent. There are adjustments that are made for certain things which are counted and not counted in terms of aviation and so on. So it's a little bit technical, but the headline point is we were at 794. The most recent figures, and there's a 2-year lag for the figures, the most recent figures which were reported earlier this year, 2020, present the position as at 2018, and that produces a figure that we're at 476 million tonnes net. So we're down by 40% from the starting point. But obviously, if we're to get to net by 2050, net zero, we need to lose the other 60%. And then the little graphic shows that actually within the devolved regions, Scotland and Wales, they have set, as it were, different targets, albeit they're not actually part of the legislative requirement, so they're not mandatory targets, but that just gives you an idea of how the different devolved governments are proceeding. So then I think there's a chart which shows that in a sense, fairly simple terms, where we were, where we are, and as you can see that to get to net zero, effectively all of the red, or the, I'm not sure, it's a funny shade of red, but anyway, all of that red would need to disappear if we're to get down to zero by the time we get to 2050. But then we get to what I think is the point that just needs to be borne in mind, is that the target is expressed as a net zero, not an absolute zero. And I've just very simplistically taken 3 examples which would all achieve net zero. If we produce no emissions at all, we would have no need for offsetting and we would have net zero. If we carried on effectively producing the same scale of emissions as we are at 2018, that was that 476 figure, so that's the 5 million tonnes, effectively then we would have to offset by an equivalent amount, and that would itself amount to net zero. Actually, if we doubled what we were producing today, but we could offset by as much, we would also be at net zero. So that's just the, in a sense, the thought that one needs to understand, that the target being expressed as net zero, because it's net, it doesn't necessarily mean that the target requires there to be no emissions generated. So that then leads to the point that I've just very sort of simplistically, perhaps oversimplistically illustrated, that there will be some people who will see the target as meaning effectively a hair shirt approach, because we've really got to do our utmost to remove emissions from the environment to help address the problems of climate change. And there will be those who see it as business as usual. We can effectively carry on in the way that we have been for decades, so long as we do some offsetting to address what we are pumping out into the atmosphere. So those are the two, as it were, extreme positions. The reality is, of course, going to be somewhere between the two of them, because quite clearly there will be difficulties in achieving what would be closer to a real zero rather than a net zero, in terms of the political implications of that for people's lifestyles, people's patterns of travel, people's patterns of consumption. But on the other hand, the rosy idea of business as usual, there are only so many trees that you can plant. There are only so many wind farms that you can put into the energy mix. And so realistically, unless we make some significant changes, we're not going to get there. So I have then just sort of illustrated, perhaps in a rather cynical way, that does this mean that all we can do is we've got our power stations, we're carrying on polluting, but we've got a wind turbine and we've got some trees, albeit that those particular trees don't seem to be absorbing much because they've lost all their leaves. So that's the context within which net zero sits. But what does it mean when we move from the national picture to the position when we look at projects and promoters of projects, and does it present problems for us? So, well, what I've done is, and I've done this for a number of reasons. I looked in particular at the position for national infrastructure projects, DCOs, and I've done that for a number of reasons. First, because they are some of the biggest projects taking place in the UK at present, and therefore potentially some of the projects with the largest carbon footprints and implications. Secondly, because all of them require decisions to be made by the respective secretaries of state, whether that's transport, business, etc. So therefore you're dealing with decisions which are at the ministerial level rather than individual inspectors. Third, and this is a matter of convenience, but they are all readily acceptable from the National Infrastructure website. But fourth, they have been thus far the most litigious in the field of climate change. That's to say, national infrastructure, both projects and the national planning statements that support them. So we're beginning to get a handle on how the courts have approached net zero in the context of infrastructure projects. I do say something about the TCPA regime, but that at the moment seems to be having less in terms of fruit for us to look at to see how it plays out. So what I've started by considering is this issue of, well, is the guidance actually adequate to enable net zero to be engaged with in the infrastructure world? And this is the question of bearing in mind that most of the guidance, with the exception of one NPS on geological disposal, predates the adoption of the net zero target. And so on the face of it, you might think, well, they're out of date. And that's a particular issue with the energy NPSs, which date from 2011. Also national networks, which deals obviously with our road system, and that dates from 2015. And there's a couple of cases, the Plan B Earth and the client earth case. I'm going to talk about those in a moment, so I won't deal with those now, but they both have something to say on the issue of whether the guidance needs to be reviewed. But if we move forward, we will know that this matter has been specifically litigated in the context of the energy NPSs, and this is the Good Law Project together. Mr. Dale Vince has brought a judicial review to the Secretary of State on the basis of a failure to review the energy NPSs. There is to be a rolled up hearing on the 10th of November. I say in the paper, we'd said that it might be possible to address the outcome of that by today, but it hasn't been because the case hasn't yet been heard. And what the Secretary of State has done is he's defending the challenge on the basis of saying, well, it's premature. There's no requirement yet to carry out the review because I'm thinking about it, as it were. But what he has done is he's nudged towards the position of a review. And I say that because in the most recent energy DCO decision, which was the West Burton C power station, published towards the end of last month, the Secretary of State, sorry, we can just go back to that one. Yeah, just that little quote, because you've got this rather interesting language. The relevant part of the decision letter refers to the legal challenge and then references the disclosure that's been made in that challenge. And what it says is he has disclosed that he has provisionally agreed to announce a review of the energy national policy statements in the energy white paper, and that they will not be suspended for the duration of the review. So that's sort of, it's half a decision, provisionally agreed to announce a review in a white paper which has not yet been published and which is going to be published according to that civil service language, autumn of 2020. It's long delayed, and autumn, as we know, probably lasts any time up until January of next year. So we have a bit of a limbo situation there, but the review might be coming down the line on the energy NPSs. There hasn't been a similar statement in relation to the other NPSs. So then in relation to the non-energy ones, well, we've got, as we know, the Plan B Earth decision in the Court of Appeal. Now that was dealing with what was a draft NPS, the airport's NPS, particularly concerning Heathrow Airport. And there the Court of Appeal quashed that NPS on the basis that it had failed to take into account as an obvious material consideration the net zero target, which was, in the Court of Appeal's view, part of government policy by the time that the NPS came to be designated. As you know, that was challenged in the Supreme Court by Heathrow Airport, but not challenged by the government. The case was heard earlier in October, and obviously, as you know, you can go onto the Supreme Court website and dip into or listen to the whole of the submissions, and you will note that Lord Reid described the case as complex. Any judgment, we may not get it until the new year, but you may think, if you dipped into parts of that, that certainly some members of the Supreme Court found difficulty with the Heathrow Airport position that net zero couldn't be addressed in any way other than through the mechanisms of the Climate Change Act and its review provisions, because the Supreme Court made the point that the way that the target is expressed is at least in terms of the target. So a target of at least, they thought, opened the door to doing more than at least. So anyway, we will wait and see how that goes, but certainly a very interesting debate, that might appear to throw up problems then for the other non-energy NPSs. And this is the matter. No, I think we do need to move on to the next slide, I think, Estelle. The client Earth case. And this is a challenge to the Drax decision. And in Drax, the position reached, the Secretary of State granted permission for a gas-powered power station, and challenged on the basis that it failed to take into account the climate change implications of that measured against net zero. Mr. Justice Holgate said, well, that's all very interesting, but it's actually legally irrelevant at the decision-making stage, because there is a statutory mechanism for reviewing the NPSs. The NPSs have not been reviewed through that process. At the time of his judgment, there was no judicial review requiring or seeking for them to be reviewed. And so he said that's simply not something you could introduce at the decision-making stage. That is itself a decision that's subject to appeal. And I just make the point that the position under the TCPA regime could well be different for this reason, that under the 2008 Act, sections 5 and 6 deal specifically with NPSs and their review, and they do place a statutory duty on the Secretary of State to carry out a review, including if he considers that there's been a significant change of circumstance since it was adopted. Whereas in relation to TCPA, as we all know from section 70 subsection 2, the decision has to have regard to anything which is a material consideration, and that could include material changes of circumstance since whatever policy was put in place. So you might see a divergence between what would happen if the matter came before the courts in a TCPA Act regime compared to the 2008 Act regime. So then moving on, what I've done in the paper, and I'm certainly not going to do now, is I've looked at recent, first of all, transport decisions, and I also look at energy decisions to see, well, how have they actually been dealt with by the Secretary of State? And I've picked out decisions since, obviously, the change to the Climate Change Act and the adoption of net zero. And what we see in very summary terms is that the Secretary of State is not that interested, I'm afraid, in net zero. And the cases really fall into sort of two. There are those where there is a positive contribution to net zero in overall terms, particularly with the rail freight interchanges, in the sense that the movement of freight from road to rail could be generally said to have a benefit in carbon emission terms. And so that benefit is, as it were, being pocketed by the promoters and referred to, at least in passing, by the Secretary of State. Whereas with the road schemes, and I including that bridges, including the iconic late loading third crossing, which I think you can see illustrated there, which I was very pleased to have a part in helping to promote. But with the road schemes, what the Secretary of State has said is, well, okay, you've looked at whether or not you're going to make a change to net zero. Yes, there will be some increase in your carbon emissions, but it's not going to be significant enough to have any effect on the achievement of the overall targets, and therefore it either doesn't count as a factor that I need to weigh against the proposal, or if it does, it doesn't weigh very heavily against the proposal. So effectively, the carbon implications, that kind of net zero level in terms of the national target, has not resounded in the decision-making process. If we move to the energy cases, and again, I've given you recent examples, it's broadly speaking a similar message, except that here, because the majority of these schemes are providing lower carbon sources of energy, the benefit side goes into the bag as a positive, and so far as the negatives, which is the Drax gas powered or the West Burton gas powered, it's not thought to be significant enough to have any real implications. I've also just updated you on this slide compared to in the paper, that some of these decisions have either been the subject of legal challenge, or there's a legal challenge in the Riverside Energy case, which has now been withdrawn. It was withdrawn by the Mayor shortly before it was heard. So then I think that brings us to, there's one planning TCPA Act case, which is the High Thorn mineral extraction case. Again, you might think this was a case where the negative was there and pretty striking. Again, the Secretary of State was not sufficiently troubled by that as to decide that net zero would be a reason for refusing planning permission. So that brings me to my very simplistic conclusion, which is, if you've got a project which is of a scale that there will be certainly some measurable increase in emissions by reason of the proposal, you need to address that in your application, so at least the decision maker gets a handle on the scale. But unless your scale was very, very significant indeed, and there are no instances of any DCO decisions where that has arisen, it will not be a hurdle at the project level for you getting a consent, but you may be able to rely on your positive contributions to offset some negative in a different environmental field. So those were my contributions, and now we move to the probably more exciting bits from Estelle.
Thank you very much indeed, Michael. Just to be absolutely sure, can you nod, Michael, if you can hear me? Very good, okay. As Michael indicated, I'm yet to provide you with the written elements of my presentation. They will arrive shortly after we have finished. Well, maybe that's probably what I shouldn't say. They will arrive at some point very soon. But you'll have the slides, and my aim is to address in sufficient detail today what's on the slides to give you a really good taster of what's to come. So first, a coda between Michael's part of the presentation and my part of the presentation. And this coda will take two forms. First, just to alert you to a hearing that's taking place on the 17th, 18th, I think it's just 2 days of November. And that's in a case called Finch against Surrey County Council. And that's one of the first Town and Country Planning Act cases, which is going to deal explicitly with net zero in an EIA aspect, and will deal with precisely the type of analysis that Michael has just made, i.e., is it right for a decision maker to address the impacts of a project and comparing those impacts to the entirety of the United Kingdom's carbon budget? Because of course, compared to that carbon budget, which deals with every potential emission that can occur in the United Kingdom, from hospitals and universities and schools, to the whole of the transport industry, to the whole of power, to the whole of agriculture, the extent to which it's feasible for any single project, even a very large emitting project, to make a dent on the entirety of the UK's carbon budget, such that a decision maker might be moved to take that into account against the project, is something that is controversial. And that approach as a metric is controversial. And the Surrey case, the Finch case, which deals with oil extraction in Surrey, is one of the first cases that will be dealing with that. The second aspect of the coda to Michael's presentation is just to focus on the impacts of climate change in the United Kingdom. And those of you who've already watched our keynote might have seen that Richard Buxton, when we were discussing the impacts of climate change, mentioned impacts that are significantly felt in other areas of the world, for example, breaking up of the sea ice, but we didn't really talk about the impacts in the United Kingdom. And it is the case that the United Kingdom is presently significantly impacted by climate change. We have in the area of Skipsea the fastest collapsing cliffs in Northern Europe, something that has been recognised by media outlets as diverse as the Mail and the Independent. And indeed, there are a number of houses which are situated on the edge of the cliff, which is likely will be falling into the sea within the next 10 years. and will likely have to be abandoned. In Fairbourne, on the other side, on the other coast, the Welsh coast, sea level rise is claiming an entire village. And the local authority has indicated that it's unlikely that steps will be taken to save the village, and it's very likely that the village of Fairbourne will have to be evacuated and the houses left to sea level rise. And there are a number of other areas. Haysborough in Norfolk, that's another area where properties are falling into the sea. And there are so many of these areas that are affected by the changes in sea level and the changes in coastal conditions that are caused by climate change, that even confused.com has got into the act and has put out on its website this little interactive tool where you can realize whether your dream coastal property is actually going to turn into a nightmare fairly shortly. So climate change is impacting the United Kingdom and is doing so severely in certain areas. I'll also mention when I get to one other element, overheating, which is a significant impact now, and water, which is going to become an impact shortly. But the other reason to mention this is, of course, that any greenhouse gas emissions are potentially contributing to an increase, not just here, but indeed anywhere in the world. And so when in my discussions with Richard Buxton, when I was mentioning that our changes to the way we operate in the United Kingdom might not necessarily be assisting with the breaking up of the sea ice in the Arctic, I was plainly wrong. Any emissions that we save in this country will be emissions that will contribute to reducing or mitigating climate change in the entirety of the globe. So what are the business opportunities that come out of these catastrophes? And I'm going to deal both with development and infrastructure as a separate topic. And I'm going to start off with development, thinking of development as housing development, commercial development, those types of schemes. And there are a number of things. I'm going to focus in on a couple of these in a sec, but I'll just give you an overview of where there are some interesting developments and where I think that there are going to be opportunities as a result. So there are two standards that you're going to need to be aware of. There's a potential for a buildings and heat strategy to be announced by the government in 2020. And there's been consultation already on the Future Homes Standard. That consultation took place in 2019 and finished in February 2020. And the Future Homes Standard is likely to be released at some point this year. And the reason that I'm more optimistic than I was previously about the government actually releasing these sorts of standards is for two reasons. First, the Climate Change Committee has been going on for some long time now. And each progress report, since I think about 2016, but certainly the last ones in 2019 and 2020, each progress report emphasizes the need for a proper approach to climate change in building standards and the need to put new standards in place to achieve either low carbon or net zero housing. And it is the Climate Change Committee has started to say quite strongly in its statements that it's simply unacceptable that this country is still building houses now, houses since the net zero target was put in place, that are not compliant with what is going to be required and that are going to have to be retrofitted, despite the fact that standards exist, and I'll talk about passive house in the next slide. Standards exist which would permit low energy or net zero construction to take place. Well, of course, this government is chairing the next climate change international conference, which was due to take place, I think maybe this week or indeed next week, before coronavirus, and will take place next year. That's COP26. And the government has indicated that there's going to be a slew of announcements towards the end of the year, in advance of the year in which it hosts COP20, which will propel the United Kingdom forward. And my bet is that some of those announcements will include building standards. In terms of the opportunity then, why do I think this is an opportunity? Well, developers now who are able to bring forward developments, especially housing developments that might not otherwise be policy compliant, who can show that they are low carbon, or that they meet the passive house standards, or that they are ahead of the curve in terms of what's required by building regulations, is something that can be a strong mitigation favor, or a strong benefit in favor of a grant of planning permission, even where the local plan may not support that development. There's also a significant pool of green finance which is becoming available. There is a Green Finance Institute which was put in place a couple of years ago, and is increasingly engaged with financing development projects, not just infrastructure projects, but other development projects. And so there is a pool of money which is becoming more and more available. And indeed, the Green Finance Initiative is looking into explicitly financing greener future buildings. And so in these straitened times, when there's difficulties with gaining investment, the fact that there is explicit funding set aside for green development is something that I think is a significant positive. I've mentioned water efficiency. That's going to be one of the key things, I think, for the future, that houses will need to be able to show a strong and high standard of water efficiency, because although this is a country which tends to think of itself as water being highly accessible, in fact, there are many areas of the United Kingdom where it's very difficult to abstract water, and where we're water poor. And so water efficient buildings are going to become more and more, I think, something of a necessity. And finally, I'll say something about mitigation. And this is one of the ways in which developments, A, have to be careful, and B, can identify themselves as developments worthy of support. And I'm thinking in particular in relation to overheating. And some on this webinar might recall that last year, a retirement living village, Churchill Retirement Living, was proposed, 33 retirement apartments in Bristol, redevelopment of a former nursery site. And permission was refused by the council, and indeed the appeal dismissed on the basis, well, on a number of bases, but the main one was a climate mitigation failure. So there was evidence that was brought forward by the council and was accepted by the inspectorate, that the design and layout of the proposed development was not such that there was proper climate mitigation, and that there was a high risk of residents experiencing overheating, i.e. uncomfortably high internal temperatures, given the way that climate change has affected the United Kingdom's temperatures. So thinking about that type of mitigation as part of the design of a development is becoming an increasingly important thing to do to stave off difficulties and to assist with achieving a grant of planning permission. And finally, if there are those of you who are interested in wholly new developments of potential types of housing projects, then there's been a fascinating development recently at the University of Salford, which is called the Energy House 2.0 project. And that project sees the university working with a number of organisations, including AECOM and others. And they've created a £16 million research and testing facility with the idea of developing and looking at the practical ways in which buildings, i.e. potentially buildings that are constructed off-site, or ways of developing construction on-site, can properly be shown to be net zero buildings. And they have testing facilities, including the ability to change the temperature against which the building will be tested, so that you can demonstrate the credentials of the building. There again is money in this, and there's funding available for this, and it's something that I think is quite exciting. I said that I'd focus a bit in on two things. I've mentioned on this slide a little bit more detail the Green Finance Institute, which has launched a zero carbon heating task force that is looking in particular at one of the key areas for net zero, which is heating. And I'll say something else about that when I get to talking about hydrogen. but heating is a key element of ensuring that we achieve net zero, and there is financing available for projects that are dealing with that matter. The Passive House Standard is an international standard which looks at low carbon, low energy buildings, commercial buildings, residential buildings, both multiple residential buildings and individual residential buildings. And I just mentioned here on the slide a development of which you may be aware because it did win the Sterling Prize, Norwich City Council's development in Goldsmith Street, which was the UK's largest residential certified passive house development. And that's the other thing that I think is an extraordinary opportunity, that excellence in development is starting to be recognised as including, maybe not specifically passive house standards, although that is included, but low carbon and net zero development is important for demonstrating that excellence. So moving on to infrastructure, there are a lot of opportunities in the infrastructure sphere. And indeed, the National Infrastructure Commission put out a document in March 2020, which was looking at opportunities in the power sector, and plainly renewable energy projects is one element, but there are a lot of other elements. There's been a very significant degree of funding available for electric car charging. There's a lot of support for hydrogen, which I'll talk about in a bit more detail in a sec. There's been projects coming forward which are to do with biogasification, and there's been geothermal exploration in Cornwall and Devon, and there is a large geothermal project coming forward there. And these are the sorts of projects that, both in terms of investment and government support, get significant support. If you're particularly interested in opportunities in the infrastructure arena, I would recommend this Catapult document, which is called Innovating to Net Zero. And it looks in some detail at the potential for opportunities within infrastructure. Michael mentioned rail freight, and indeed the National Infrastructure Commission has already done work on cross-modal freight strategy as one of the things to boost net zero, and that again is something that is being strongly supported. I wanted to mention hydrogen as a specific area because you may have seen, not just because of the proliferation of webinars in lockdowns, but because this is the way the market is going, that there has been a lot of discussion about hydrogen recently, and including webinars, for example, by developers under the title, "Why is everybody talking about hydrogen?" And the answer to that question is potentially twofold. First, hydrogen is seen as a way to re-energize the existing gas network. And there are difficulties because hydrogen particles are really tiny, and we have to be sure that we're dealing with green hydrogen. There are all sorts of colors of hydrogen, I learned when I went to this webinar, and only one of them is actually a carbon efficient type of hydrogen. But anyway, there are ways that the energy system can be re-energized using the gas network and hydrogen. And there's a lot of development around the way in which hydrogen can be integrated into other sorts of development. So imagine you have an industrial complex, for example, where there's going to maybe be small scale renewable. Hydrogen can be included within that as a way to take what the energy is that's being produced by the small scale renewable, take potential bio or waste matter, which can be converted into hydrogen. And that can then be used, all the power can then be concentrated, and hydrogen can be used to power whatever the industrial facility is that is being undertaken. Natural England have also been looking into the use of hydrogen integrated into onshore wind energy as a way to even generate more power out of renewables. So hydrogen is something that is again, generating a lot of investment buzz, and B, a way in which developments can stand out or stand above other sorts of developments and really address carbon impact, especially in high impactful development, and industrial development in particular stands out there. Carbon capture and storage, I mention a couple of things, because the whole net zero project really relies on not just reducing emissions, which is a key element and one of the most important things that can happen, but it relies on emissions being caught and stored, and emissions indeed being removed from the atmosphere. And carbon capture and storage is an area where there is significant potential and opportunity for infrastructure development. You may be aware that the government rather pulled the rug out from underneath the carbon capture and storage sector a couple of years ago, but that seems to be, that position seems to be changing. The government certainly has been very supportive of carbon capture and storage, though not necessarily with money, but it seems that there's money coming from elsewhere in relation to carbon capture and storage. We've got at least one national infrastructure project, the Teesside Cluster Carbon Capture and Usage Project, which has gone to stage 2 consultation and is being lined up to come forward as a DCO at some point once the environmental impact assessment has been produced. There's also an £800 million budget that has been put aside for funding carbon capture projects. Teesside is one, Merseyside is another, and there's one in Scotland. And this is within the context of the difficulties with money coming forward due to coronavirus. The announcements were made in March, but they seem to have been stuck to, so there is investment available. And that's what I say on the next slide, that there are these clusters that are being developed, which may well gain a significant degree of support. So what do we take from all of this? Well, two things. First, that there are significant opportunities, both in terms of financing and in terms of making projects that stand out and that offer a significant degree of benefit in order to gain planning permission, which are available both under the town and country planning regime and under the development consent order regime. But we also need to have an eye to the future. And this is why I thought we'd end with all sharing an ale. And given that I know how much Michael enjoys sharing an ale with his clients, I thought it apt too. Two things to look to beyond net zero. First, my prediction is that being a net zero company, and there are net zero companies, and one of the big house builders, Barratt, has dedicated itself to being net zero by 2040, to bringing certain aspects of net zero forward by 2030. And that is an excellent step, because we won't be able to achieve anything without the big house builders shifting to that position. But my prediction is that that's going to be passé in a couple of years. And that where organisations are moving, and Brewdog is one of the first in the UK to leverage this, is net negativity. So that companies are showing that they take out carbon, that they're not just net zero, but they are taking carbon out of the atmosphere more than they are creating carbon. And in Brewdog's is an interesting example, because they've got this extraordinary sustainability report, the front page of which might have some relevance to stuff going on elsewhere in the world today, by the way. They have this amazing sustainability report, which is underpinned by research done by Mike Berners-Lee, who's one of the main experts in the United Kingdom on the way that carbon is measured. And it's quite something to see how they are stating as one of their unique selling points that they are going to be carbon negative. And it's also right to recognise, and that's why I've given you a screenshot there of a paper by Anderson, Broderick and Stoddard, Kevin Anderson being one of the leading climate change experts in the United Kingdom. There is a growing concern about the net zero project itself, and there are voices of dissent about the extent to which net zero can indeed achieve what the Paris obligations require, especially for developed countries like the United Kingdom, whose contribution to greenhouse gas emissions in the many years since the Industrial Revolution up to the Paris Agreement means that significant steps have to be taken by those countries to remove emissions or to bring emissions down. And the concern about net zero is that, in fact, for a proper Paris compliant pathway to be achieved, really we have to mitigate to a factor of 2 or 2 times greater than net zero is asking us to mitigate. So my prediction there is that while net zero is going to be something that is the main target to be achieved, for reasons of science and for reasons of market positioning, net negativity is going to be where all the cool kids end up. So, time for questions. And I know one has come in, which I haven't had a chance to look at yet, but maybe Michael might speak to that.
Well, yes, I have looked at that, and it's a question that's actually quite easy to answer, but fortunately by you rather than me, because
Okay.
what the question was asking was, could you please repeat the reference details to that Finch case so that people can no doubt go and do their own sort of monitoring? So perhaps you just give us a little bit of a resume of that. That would be a helpful start.
Yes, I can certainly do that. So it's Finch and Surrey County Council. The hearing is on the 17th and 18th of November in the High Court. And the claimant is Sarah Finch. And indeed, if you Google Horse Hill Oil, you will find all the material you would want in the world about the particular legal challenge. She has a crowdfunding page where you can read about the nature of the case. I understand, although I'm not entirely certain because of the new lockdown, it might be that the hearing is remote and people can participate remotely. I would imagine that's the case, although I know the courts had been favouring in-person hearings and the hearing had been gearing up for in-person, so don't take my word on it. We, and I'm one of the participants in that hearing, haven't quite been told the details yet.
No. And the defendant is the county council because it's a minerals application. Is that
yes, the defendant is the county council because it's a minerals application, but a wider point is being raised, not necessarily squarely on net zero, although it's related. A wider point is being raised about the lawfulness of the NPPF's approach to dealing with other regulatory regimes and whether carbon impacts, for example, are going to be dealt with by other pollution control regimes. So the Secretary of State is involved as a party, although that only arose peripherally in a sense. And it's likely, given the way that the various parties are arguing, that everybody's going to be saying to the court that the NPPF can be interpreted compliantly with various other obligations, such that it doesn't stand in the way of taking greenhouse gas emission impact into account when you're assessing the environmental impact of a project.
Good, thank you. Well, well, hopefully that provides people with the information they needed if they missed your initial reference. We've just got a few minutes left, so I don't know whether there are any further questions that participants have got. Certainly there's none at the moment on the Q&A function. That doesn't mean to say you've got to oh yeah, wait a minute, no, we have got some more questions, right. So question 1, and I think I'm going to put this one to Estelle in the first instance because she might be able to give us a view. The question is, how much weight can be given to the net zero carbon emissions audit bill 2019-21 given its delay, it's still draft legislation?
Yes, so the question anticipates the answer, which is it's draft legislation. And so little weight can be given at the moment, although it does indicate a direction of travel. Something did pop into my head though, Michael, when you were talking about Town and Country Planning Act aspects. And that was the talk fracking case, Stevenson. which Mr. Justice Dove, in which Mr. Justice Dove found that part of the NPPF was unlawful. And what was said in Stevenson was that broad developments, scientific developments and potentially policy developments, but in particular scientific developments that take place after policies have been put in place, can be taken into account in the decision-making process and weight can be given to them. And that's the way in which it's being argued that things like the Climate Change Committee's Net Zero report, the recommendations in that report, the recommendations from the IPCC, all of those elements can form part of the decision-making matrix. And then it's for the decision maker to put what weight they will, as long as they're not being irrational on those material considerations.
Yeah. Fine, thank you. That's helpful. Then we've also had a question which, in a sense, raises a point. I mean, it's specifically related in this context to dealing with climate change, but it's a point that comes up in a number of different planning fields, is the extent to which a local planning authority, when dealing with an individual planning application, can seek to require, in this instance, energy efficiency, which goes beyond building regulations standards. And the question also makes the point that the PPG refers to the Code for Sustainable Homes, but that there are some local authorities, including some in London, that would seek to go further than that. And I will ask you, Estelle, for your views in a moment, but I have to say my initial response is, in a sense, well, how many resources does the local authority have to defend appeals? Because it seems to me that the issue is if the developer were to appeal on the basis that it was an unjustified requirement, what would be your chances of persuading an inspector that in order to make the development acceptable in planning terms, that this was a necessary as opposed to a desirable requirement? And if you can't show that the development would be unacceptable without whatever it is that you're seeking to impose, I have to say I wouldn't fancy your chances terribly much on an appeal, particularly if the way that you were trying to do it was by way of the imposition of a positive condition requiring things to be done, which went beyond the requirements of building regulations. So that would be my view.
That is very prudent advice, Michael. I would be slightly more bullish in just one sense, in that in light of the Stevenson line of decision making, that if there is scientific evidence and other evidence which goes to the heart of what you're dealing with, which postdates policy, it is open to the decision maker to rely on that and incorporate that into decision making. And I think a case can be made. Query whether, I mean, Michael might think that it has less chance of success than I might, but a case can be made where an authority is seeking to impose higher standards that is based on not the policies that are in place at the moment, but in the clear direction of travel that is required by the evidence from the Climate Change Committee's reports and has been called for by the committee itself. And especially if it is the case that the authority has declared a climate emergency or has taken some steps within their own local sphere. And I think it would be quite brave, actually, in those circumstances for an inspector to say that it was not lawful for the authority to require the steps to be taken, or that the conditions test wasn't met, given that actually when you look at the other things, the other contributions or the other ways in which authorities will often require developers to jump through hoops, given that those often aren't evidenced either particularly strongly. Now, the upshot of that might be, Michael, that you'd say, well, there are other contributions that developers shouldn't be paying either. To which the response is probably that's true. But in this circumstance, I think there is a cogent argument to be made, a defensible cogent argument to be made.
Thank you, Estelle. Thank you. Well, clearly there's always scope for argument when you want to try to achieve something. Then there's a couple of further questions. One question I'm going to frankly admit I don't know the answer to. I will identify it as a question, and if Estelle, you do know the answer, then feel free. But the question is, how much influence do we perceive the new regulation 25B of the building regulations in relation to nearly zero energy buildings? How much influence do we perceive that will have, presumably on the achievement of net zero? I have to say, the reason why I'm not going to answer it is I have to say I don't know the detail of what regulation 25B requires.
Yeah, so I've only looked briefly in the context of drafting the paper properly for this talk. I've only looked briefly at regulation 25B. I was hopeful when I looked at it, but that's as far as my thinking got. Right,
thank you. And then the last question, which I think probably relates more to the things that I was attempting to address, was to what extent one can take the cumulative impact of a number of apparently insignificant local projects and come to the conclusion that they would, on a cumulative basis, jeopardise the achievement of the national net zero target. And obviously, so as it were, if you step back and just looked at it intellectually or in the abstract, you would say, well, in a sense, there must come a point where a lot of small things will amount to a big thing, because that's just sort of fairly straightforward. But it does seem to me that when you go beyond that, as it were, abstract position to putting it into tangible terms, you would face, I think, insuperable difficulties in showing that the scale of an individual project was of a magnitude, even when taken together with a number of other projects, that it would jeopardize the target, particularly bearing in mind that we are at the moment at 2020 using data from 2018 for the national picture, looking towards a target which in legal terms doesn't have to be achieved until 2050. And albeit that there are interim carbon budgets and one can surmise on trajectories, trying to demonstrate that actually the target by 2050 could not be achieved by a number of things in combination is, to my mind, something which is just not going to be practical to imagine could be successfully shown. And after all, if you take in the sense the extreme case of the Drax power station decision, I know it's subject to appeal on point of law, but if you look at that on its merits, that was, as it were, a very bleak case, because that clearly was a very significant generator of carbon, and that wasn't felt to cut the mustard to the mind of the decision maker. And so it seems to me that it's unlikely, certainly for the next decade or so, for anybody to successfully show that the cumulative position is that we're not going to be able to achieve the 2050 target.
Yeah, so I think Drax is, it stands in the way of a lot of these sorts of arguments. There is potential, though, for this point to be tested. It's a point that's being run, the cumulative point is being run in a number of regional airport expansion well, one at inquiry, Bristol Airport, and one which is yet to go to the committee, Leeds Bradford Airport. And in both those regional airport developments, the point is being put that these regional airports should be considered in combination with all the other regional airport development in order to understand the extent to which there's going to be additional greenhouse gas impact. And indeed, it reaches the Drax point, because even if you take them all together, they're probably not going to be as much, or maybe not much more than Drax would have been. So where does that get you? And the line that's being put is, you don't take the national target, you take a regional target, or you take a sector-specific target to do with the airline industry or the particular industry that's involved. And when you get to those sorts of ways of putting the metric, then the position looks different. But there's a hill to climb in getting that analysis accepted. But there are test cases which are coming, I think.
Yeah. Well, thank you for those thoughts, Estelle. Right, well, we have completed, I think, our allotted time slot. I think we've addressed the questions that we've had, and thank you very much for those and helping to make it a interactive event, and hopefully a bit more thought-provoking for all of us. And I've got my homework, which is to go and read Regulation 25B of the building regulations, and I shall look out with interest at some of those cases which are clearly in the pipeline, either this month or next month. And we hope you all stay well and survive the next period of our new lockdown existence. Thank you all for participating, and hope you also dip into the rest of our planning week.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, everybody. Lovely to see you.